there are a lot of tripwires. Like, as soon as you hit that tripwire where they think, oh, you're one of them, you're one of the out group, immediately they assume everything you're saying is out of bad faith. You're saying it in service to your side. You're trying to fool them. There isn't real honesty involved in somebody's conversation. It's that bad faith assumption that makes it difficult up front. And that's the problem with trying to treat this like a standard debate.
Today we're going to talk about one of the biggest concerns that everyone shares related to politics, and that is extremism. So extremism comes in many forms, but it is really that tail end of the polarized spectrum where someone is so incredibly wedded to a particular identity and a particular set of core beliefs that go along with this identity. They become a member of an extreme in-group. And once that happens, relating to other people becomes extremely difficult. And if you have friends or maybe relatives or even acquaintances who've gone down this road, it becomes very disturbing. And one could be really at a loss as to how to approach such a person. So we're going to try to tackle that extremism component today. What is it? How does it occur? And then most importantly, perhaps, how do we approach someone with a positive attitude to try to undo some of the most extreme versions of what their beliefs may be?
Yeah, I don't think it can be overstated just how important this discussion really is. In fact, just speaking for myself, this is what brought me into the fold of wanting to contribute in this space, wanting to learn more about political psychology, is the whole question of extremism. In fact, I think many viewers who might be a little skeptical in some ways are bristling at the thought of confronting in a very friendly, bridge-building way someone in dialogue who doesn't share their belief system. This might stem from a very traumatic experience they might have had, let's say with a family member or a close friend who they saw in some ways being overtaken by some sort of ideological allegiance to something that's very negative, something very malevolent seeming. And it seems as though that person can't be reached anymore. In fact, when we talk about the tactics of dialogue, one might very well have that person in mind. And they think, well, hey, if Dan and Michael met this person, they would realize there's no reaching this person. They're long gone. They're too far gone, right? But I think where Dan and I want to come into space is to show that there's a lot more going on than than one would think is there. Just looking at that exterior, that brutish exterior someone can have when they've gone into that extremist mode. Because I think what it really conceals is somebody who is motivated primarily by fear, by seeing the world as a very hostile place, seeing their values besieged, and seeing that they have no choice but engage in this existential conflict. The stakes couldn't be more dire to that person's mind. I think that if that's a good starting point for thinking about extremism and where it comes from.
Right, negative emotions and fear being one of those major drivers of behavior. So the more aversive the emotion state, the more one is trying to escape it. And that is the motivation in many ways for affiliating with some very hardcore in-group. They are seen as like-minded, and that group can take on an energy and a dynamic of its own style to the point where people in some sense become acolytes to certain positions. And what's very difficult about that, of course, is that if you're very locked in on certain core truths or beliefs that you've come around to seeing in the world, it can be very, very awkward and perilous to try to approach someone. Certainly you can't do it head on where you just simply confront aggressively that belief. What that would probably lead to is a hardening of the belief and a validation in some sense that the person is under threat. So I think that's a good starting point for where some of the extreme versions of political attitudes come from, or highly polarized individuals, is that there's something missing. They can sense something missing in their life. They can sense perhaps a lack of social opportunity, of a lack of commonality with others, and they find refuge in a narrow in-group, and then that can take on an oversized element within their identity.
I think it's a leverage point for having a sense of purpose and empowerment in one's life, where everything else about their life feels like they're disempowered or alienated and they can't find their place. This is like the fast food version of finding that. And it's very rich and high calorie. There's so much going for it, like that whole sense that one is highly significant and engaged in a sort of cosmic struggle of good versus evil. That's one thing about extremist ideologies that they all seem to have in common, is this element of sort of being in this heroic struggle, right? This Manichaean dualism of one is on the side of virtue and good against some malevolent force. And that's really the shape and the form of all these ideologies, where it's very difficult to reach someone because up front, there isn't a very charitable view one has of the interlocutor, the conversation partner. In fact, there are a lot of tripwires. Like, as soon as you hit that tripwire where they think, oh, you're one of them, you're one of the outgroup, immediately they assume everything you're saying is out of bad faith. You're saying it in service to your side. You're trying to fool them. There isn't real honesty involved in somebody's conversation. It's that bad faith assumption that makes it difficult up front. And that's the problem with trying to treat this like a standard debate, where I'm going to go point by point, try to dismantle and disassemble their argument using logic, because beneath the surface, there's a highly emotional element to what draws somebody into this world, even though the very tip of the spear might be someone engaging in a very dispassionate, objective discourse, right? But what that conceals are the true motives for what gets them involved in a group like that.
It's probably worth pointing out that there's a difference between having an extreme view and presenting it in a manner that's constructive, and having built an extreme identity around oneself. Because that contrarianism is important. We need naysayers, we need devil's advocates, we need people to point out the flaws in societal thinking. They do a service to society if they're constructive about, sometimes someone really does have a point, and it may feel extreme in relation to mainstream, and that's not really what we're talking about. The well-reasoned argument that just isn't popular right now is a bit of a different type of thing than true extremism, because in those cases you'd expect that contrarian, constructive individual to really offer their wisdom, offer their position, try to work hard perhaps on getting others to see their point. And there's really a lot of value in such a thing happening. Where someone can become an extremist is when whatever they're saying that's not popular maybe with others becomes their identity, and they become wedded to it, and they're not being constructive. They're actually using it as a suit of armor to insulate themselves and their in-group, by extension, against the mainstream. And often the mainstream takes on an amorphous kind of quality for extremists, where they're fighting a battle against straw men. It's very hard to pin down the specifics of exactly what they have a grievance with, because they sort of are trafficking in narratives, almost of their own making or of their peers, which can become conspiratorial, can become detached from day-to-day reality and detached from evidence. And such a person is then in a position where they're defending something that's extremely hard to actually find evidence for. And sometimes the lack of clear evidence for something can appear to become evidence of it, that there's some kind of secrecy going on and people are willfully trying to suppress whatever this evil force is. And so that's where it becomes very dysfunctional and very hard to grapple with. So I think that's an important starting point, is like you can have a contrarian opinion presented in a productive way to get others thinking, and that ought to be very tightly coupled to evidence. Or you can have an extreme opinion that really is not open to negotiation in any way, and it's more of a throwing down a gauntlet than it is doing something that might be helpful to the group.
I'm glad you point out how important it is to analyze what we mean by extremists or extremism. It's not, strictly speaking, the position someone holds. It's not like saying, oh, my position on guns or taxes itself is extreme. That's in its own form. But what we're talking about here is the attitude with one which holds their opinion. In fact, one could say even being a moderate or extremist, like one could be an extremist in being a moderate in the sense that I'm always going to adopt the middle ground no matter what the question is. And I'm never going to be open-minded about it. This being intransigent, being intractable, not open to reflecting on one's point of view and being open to being disproven or trying to reflect on other possible perspectives on an issue. That's the kind of extremism we're talking about here. And it seems all the more plausible when we think about the backdrop of other types of social mechanisms that are at play, including filter bubbles and echo chambers that help to kind of prop up this world, this highly paranoid world, where one has one's fellow tribes member, all kind of reinforcing and confirming this impression of the world. I think in online communities, we see this in play. A filter bubble is a sense that it's a sort of a semi-porous information feed where only the sort of information one wants to see winds up permeating into one's space. And echo chambers in the sense that a certain sentiment gets repeated again and again and again. And research on propaganda and political psychologists had demonstrated through their efforts and investigations that the mere repetition of statements, what ends up happening is psychologically, it's very difficult for us to consciously feel the difference between statement being true and it being familiar. Things that feel familiar to us seem true to us. And so the more something is repeated, the more true it feels. And so one can't even imagine having a contrary point of view, because I hear it so often. It'd be like hearing somebody say, you know what, I think 2 + 2 might actually equal 5. It would seem that one would meet that with incredulity, right? And I think many of the statements that people hold in the extremist mindset, they're axiomatic. They're self-evident in themselves. And that's why it's difficult to jostle someone free from a position like that.
To put some psychological science behind this, I think of David Sherman's work on affective perseverance. This is this idea that when an emotional bit of information comes your way, it's extremely hard to ignore. And then even if that information is discredited, it seems to have a lasting effect. Like you may have heard that this compelling news story, let's say, it was a retraction, but it doesn't actually get erased from your mindset. And in many ways, when we take in news or information, we're kind of allowing it to percolate through our system, and we kind of adopt it. And then, especially when it's emotional and a negative emotion, it's just, you can't undo that with a simple retraction of a story, because there's already a lot of modification that the brain has done, a lot of plasticity has occurred to bear up against this negative proposal. And so a lot of people will persist with that belief and sort of say, well, that original story is true, and the people trying to say it's not true are now suppressing it actively. And now you sort of have this narrative going in someone's mind that there's actually a sinister group trying to stop the truth. So I think affective perseverance really is at the core of this. And then I think of obedience research, or just going along with the crowd. Solomon Asch's work on, it's a real simple, famous experiment in which people were, participating in a group exercise in which line lengths are being judged. And, it's either the shortest, middle, or the longest line. And initially everyone's saying, well, yeah, the one that's perceptually longest is the longest line. Yep, I agree. And then somewhere along the line, the other group members who are in on the experiment begin to shift so that they're now claiming that a line not as long is the longest line. Sort of amazingly, the true participant would go along with the group, even though their own eyes were telling them otherwise, their own perceptual system. And I think that's the power of groups in many ways. You also start to question yourself among others. If everyone's saying it's this way, I must be missing something. Unless you're very egotistical, like you're just right, you're probably going to try to incorporate what others are saying. And so group dynamics can take over as well. That's the echo chamber effect that Michael alluded to. And it's not as if we're always doomed to believe what we first heard. We can certainly revise our beliefs. It's just that it doesn't always happen spontaneously for everyone. Once certain people are kind of down a road, there's a proclivity to look for evidence now that you've sort of been oriented a certain way. and confirmation bias can take hold in that case.
Some other psychological elements that are worth positing here to explain this phenomenon is a sense of sunk cost and loss aversion. When somebody has invested so much in that community, there's so much at stake there. A sense of purpose. Now one understands one's place in the world. A sense of community, because there might be others who share the same point of view. So there's a sort of ideological family one feels like they're a part of. And to give all of that up, one has anchored themselves in this community, and to give it all psychologically very painful. We're very averse to that. And especially if there's any effort that one has put into this, there's that sunk cost. There's that sense that I've already given so much of myself to this. I feel like I'm alienated from myself to give this life up. I think there's just so much that gets jettisoned along the way. It's not merely just a state of propositions to that person. It's a way of life. It's a set of rituals, thought patterns, a way of modeling the world so that it makes sense to them. One thing that was
they're also in a position where their closest friends they would be alienating those alliances, the people that are now dearest to them, kind of require that they continue to say certain things and believe certain things, and to sort of give up that belief isn't just to change your belief, it's to change your circle of social inputs.
And to remember this, to keep this at the forefront of one's mind when engaged in real time in conversation with someone like that, puts us in at least for me, it puts me in a position more of compassion and empathy, understanding what this person is dealing with, in a sense that they feel like they're going to lose so much if they were to give up this belief system. And there's a sense of being lost at sea, not having a real compass for orienting oneself in the world. And what really opened my eyes up to this, even getting into the space to begin with, a real pivotal moment for me in my life was several years ago. Sam Harris, the neuroscientist and podcaster, for his Making Sense podcast, one of his episodes, he came to Dallas, where we live. And it was in the Majestic Theater. We did a live podcast recording with one of his guests, Christian Picciolini. This was real pivotal for me, going there and watching this interview live, where Christian Picciolini, his background, he was somebody in his youth who was a member of the Hammerskins Nation. It was a neo-Nazi white nationalist group. And he himself described himself as being very violent, a very malevolent person who glorified violence, and his whole sense of purpose was division, having his side, people who had his skin color, against the rest of the world. And he talked about how fruitless it really was for anyone to engage in arguments with him. He had his blinders up. It was like rain bouncing off a windshield. Nothing was going to reach him because he expected it up front. It was built into his narrative. It was all hermetically sealed. And he said what really brought him out of that life and jostled him free, the way he phrased it very movingly, was he received compassion and understanding from those from whom he deserved it the least, from those who he looked at as objects of his hatred. And when the law caught up to him because of some of the violent behavior he engaged in, he went on this soul-searching endeavor of seeking forgiveness for the people he had wronged. And they met him with open arms and compassion that he felt like he didn't deserve at all. And it started to change his view. It brought cognitive dissonance. He was receiving kindness from people he looked at as his enemies, and he couldn't understand that at first. And it helped him to reorient himself. And now his life purpose is about helping others to extirpate themselves from a life of hate. I think it's very admirable. In fact, there is a message of hope in this. I mean, the way we deal with people like that, especially when they're violent, but it isn't just they're on message boards, on threads on YouTube, saying hateful things, but they actually go out into the world and physically cause harm to others. We think the best way to deal with them, the happy ending to that story, is they're neutralized somehow. We put them in a box and remove them from society. But here's an example of an individual, through the power of dialogue and connection, he was able to find the things that he himself recognized he really needed, a sense of community and purpose and belonging. And he found that by giving up that life of hate, there was so much more on offer that was much more filled of substance, much more fulfilling for him. And that's what gave him encouragement to be able to share that message with others.
And it may be worth pointing out that it doesn't always happen through one conversation. Mm-hmm. So it may be that certain people are going to need more exposure to alternative viewpoints. It's known as cognitive dissonance in the social psychology world, that there's this buildup of tension when the world seems to be at odds with one's beliefs. And it's not as if the switch is flipped and one just simply abandons their version of reality again, because extremists have built up a social group and an identity and a public identity and a variety of insulating layers that kind of prevent the outside world from permeating those sort of core beliefs they've become aligned with. So that's dialogue is critical and conversation is critical, and it may be the starting point and the ultimate goal for deconverting someone from a truly dysfunctional belief that's divorced from reality. But it is worth pointing out that this may need to build up over time, that someone has to come to their conclusions through a variety of perspectives. It's probably unrealistic to assume in one discussion you're going to change someone's entire identity. That isn't really the way the brain works. And again, we're talking about not just beliefs, but all the things that build up around a belief, including one's peer group and one's place in society. So sunk cost is important there. And I suppose all we can do to begin the conversation is to offer compassion and maybe ask more questions than make statements initially.
And I think it's also important to remember, I think where we really show our hands in the way we understand or analyze political beliefs, why we have certain positions when it comes to policy, it all bubbles up from our values. Right, and that individual you're speaking to is in an extremist type mode, but feels that their closely cherished values are under siege, they're in danger, and they see themselves as sort of like a sentinel. This could be happening subconsciously. It's not as though they see that they model their behavior consciously, thinking, "Oh, that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm defending my values." But that's ultimately what's going on there. Is they feel that there's a sort of a subsection of values that give a sense of dignity and purpose to humanity, human beings, and that without that, we'll all be lost. And that's really, I think, what's animating that person. They see themselves as being the hero of their own story. That's important to keep in mind. Another story I think that's worth reflecting on here. It's a very hopeful story, and I think it's one of the reasons why Dan and I are real advocates of dialogue as being part of the solution here, our toolkit. There's a story about Daryl Davis, who is a blues musician. It was a story that really touched my heart, because what he showed is that by meeting someone on a human level, so this just the cliff notes of the story. He's a blues musician who he himself, just through conversations, just through dialogue with members of the KKK and white nationalist groups, neo-Nazi groups, ended up deconverting hundreds of individuals. And very ceremoniously, many of them would give their robes to him, like their clan robes to him, saying, "I'm done with this life." And he talked about how he never even set out with the intention of deconverting them. He set out with the intention of just trying to understand. He said, "I just understand how people who never met me before could hold hateful views about me for some arbitrary characteristic like my skin color." And he met them on a level of relating them as being a fellow family, a person who has a sense of community, a sense of dignity in his life, a sense of intellectual curiosity. And he met them with such compassion and empathy that this introduced this tension, this cognitive dissonance for many of them. Like, well, how can you be this way? You're not supposed to be this way. It created surprise. This is one of the tactics of dialogue that we've talked about before, is to induce this sort of learning mode in an individual where they move off their script, away from their crystallized knowledge mode to more of a fluid reasoning mode, where they're starting to engage in a plastic process of reassembling their schemas and models and narratives about the world, is when they encounter an error in the very technical sense of some unexpected event. In this case, a very friendly conversation with a very insightful, intelligent individual who shouldn't be that, who shouldn't have those characteristics. And in some ways has those characteristics more than the people they consider their close friends and family. And many of them realized that they've been building their lives on sand, not on stone after all. And that's a story that I draw from, especially at times where the media is really popular with so many stories of extremist behavior where we can feel kind of hopeless in some ways. Like, oh, it just seems like the momentum in the other direction is so powerful and so built up. But then you see a story like that. It's a microcosm showing what is possible when, like, I consider him a real, Sherpa of conversation in some ways, right? Yeah, he's somebody who's a real he's turned into an art form of being able to reach people through the power of dialogue and words.
That's an extremely moving story and a great example of how things can unfold when an olive branch is offered, right? A willingness to understand. And I think that's something we can all carry forward in our own lives, is that understanding attitude. Seek to dig deeper, understand more about our fellow individuals that we're around, their attitudes, where they're coming from, what values drive their attitudes. And also continue to seek evidence. You do not want to reach a conclusion prematurely. And it's really worth pointing out, in a democracy, especially with a two-party system, the system is not going to help you with this. The system is really set up to align people and divide them, because you're trying to get the vote, and you can only do the one vote. You could talk about ranked choice voting, that there are other ways one can carry this out, but in a sort of winner-takes-all two-party vote, it doesn't serve the candidates particularly well to ask their voters to embrace nuance and not make their minds up right away and keep an open mind up until the moment they vote. It simply is not the way we talk about any of this. And media coverage similarly has its role is to educate and to inform. And if you're a journalist, even the most responsible centrist journalist is going to have to make some judgment and offer a conclusion at some point. They can't simply say, well, it's up to you, and obviously you should read every other story. It's just not the way our minds work. We want to reach closure. We want to make sense of the world. And so we have this tension where, especially around our two-party politics, easy answers, definitive answers are on offer constantly. The nuanced sense or the curious sense of how do we really get to the bottom of what's the best idea, and we really need to process this, that is something we can do, and we can actively seek that out. And it is often the remedy to extremism as well, in these more diabolical forms where someone is like a cult member or a gang member. Ultimately, engaging with ideas is the only remedy. Trying to fight fire with them is actually going to exacerbate the problem.
And really, I think most, when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to insight, oftentimes it comes to who's going to make the first move and who's going to start with themselves, right? I think when we locate our problems externally, outside ourselves, we can oftentimes find ourselves in this sort of Mexican standoff, where no one's willing to make a move, a gesture out of kindness, because no one really trusts the other person. But if we look within and realize, by seeing that person just one-dimensionally as just an extremist, we're ironically playing the same game. We're seeing that person as not having any sort of psychological complexity, or as having far more nuance to that person even than they would give themselves credit for. And oftentimes it's being willing to be that guide for that person, showing there's so much more to them than even they realize. And what they're looking for in life, what they think they're getting out of that ideology, they can meet those needs in other ways. And it's really an exercise of the imagination. And when we do that work for ourselves, when we are on that journey for ourselves, it's not purely hypothetical and just postulating some ideas that the other person could try, but we can speak from our own experience of ways where maybe we felt very closed-minded or narrow-minded about something, and we had our genuine insights that came from surprise, or realizing that one of the protective factors is having multiple layers of identity built in ourselves. Right? We're not just, for speaking for ourselves, yes, we might be cognitive neuroscientists, but we're not just that. We're also people with families. We're also members of our communities. Of course, we're also citizens. There might be other ways in which we can see ourselves relating to different communities in the world, and they all meet our needs in different ways. And that richness of one's life is very important, I think, as a sort of inoculating agent.
Yeah, wisdom comes from experience, not necessarily with just pure age. The more you circulate about, the more you have the world inform you, and kind of the more you bounce off of certain things or integrate into other things, the more you begin to exercise those muscles of perspective taking. And that's so important. So I think this idea of having a multi-layered identity is so important. And that's easier to do if you're diversely sampling from the world around you, especially with firsthand experience, with face-to-face conversation, not inheriting positions from the outside and then having to adopt them within your own mindset and then committing to them too much. I think that is the root of a lot of the extremism. So those points of engagement, it may feel trivial, it may feel underwhelming to have the 5-minute conversation or even the 30-second conversation with someone that seems threatening, but it can actually make a world of difference because every one of those interactions can change somebody.
Yeah, it's planting a seed, exactly, and nourishing it through a whole, it's a series of dialogues one engages in. And it shouldn't be the objective to say, well, this will only have gone well if I've changed this person's mind. We can't control other people. We shouldn't even wish to have that kind of power over others. But instead, we can take that opportunity to learn from ourselves, realizing that I might have started thinking this person was a lost cause. They're too far gone. And then come to see through a relationship, through a friendship with this individual who has such a different perspective from me, to see the humanity in them. And it also widens the aperture of my ability to empathize with others. In the next episode, we're going to talk about ways in which we can take action for ourselves when it comes to the way we frame issues, so framing effects, the way we consume media. We ourselves can prop up an extremist opinion unwittingly through our own actions, the way we bring in nutrition for our worldviews. Instead of having a healthy world, we can have a very toxic and very warlike worldview if we are not taking deliberate steps to protect ourselves against that. And so I think that this is a nice segue to moving in that direction of the conversation.
That's right, and the relevance of fear and anger and negative emotions comes up yet again in that instance in which we're making inferences. So information processing always has some emotional component, some values component, and then the semantics are built around all of that. So it's like a multi-layered process, and the more you can try to see down to the core, the more insight you get.
Absolutely.
This was a really important conversation. We look forward to talking with you again.
Absolutely. We appreciate your attention, and feel free to leave a comment below and subscribe to receive more content from our channel.